Hello from my side. I'm Daniel. I'm working in the HCI group in the lab of Marc Latoschik in Würzburg. And I'm happy to present this to you today. It's most likely not a very typical SUI paper, but there's some spatial stuff involved, uses and interactions, so bear with me. And the background of this research or of this line of research we are doing is that communication will most likely become more immersive and it will become more embodied, right? Social VR systems today already allow VR communication in remote places, and therefore to do so, behavioral data is sensed, transmitted, and replicated. And previous research found that VR can decouple this visual representation of behaviors from the actual behavior users performed. And the construction or the approach we are following is that avatars and agents can be merged to hybrid technologies that allow to modify these behaviors based on known social phenomena. And so collaborative and social VR kind of enable to hack human communication, if you want to say so, without having this giving this a negative wording. So the prototype we're presenting today is based on mimicry, social mimicry, behavioral mimicry, and mimicry, as well as being mimicked, has led to positive aspects, liking, rapport, affiliation. Basically, it shows that we are connecting very good if we mimic, but also being mimicked has the same positive effects. And previous research on agents showed that agents can adapt these behaviors or behavioral patterns and similarly create this higher liking, higher rapport. So I picked some examples of random politicians. It fits the topic of the day today. And as you can see, the smile is is the same. Both people are leaning back, right? Both have their elbows on the lean there, and both kind of overcross the legs. Whereas in other random examples, this might not be the case. For example, the hands are held differently. One person is leaning front and one person is leaning to the back. One person has the legs open and one person has the legs closed. So to give it, to put this in a simulation, basically what we did is we had a motion tracking system tracking both users which were immersed in VR in a VR simulation with HMDs. And what we did is we split the simulation into two asymmetric simulations. So the tracking of one person would be, the simulation of one person would not be the same as the simulation of the other person, because what we did was we artificially kind of mapped the behavior of myself if I was the person communicating with a 3-second delay to the other partner. So I would see my own behavior delayed for 3 seconds mapped to the other partner. And this kind of machinery we build around that the simulation would kind of trigger and control this transformation. So from time to time, I would see my own behavior mapped to the other partner. And this is basically how it worked. It was a simple state machine. We excluded the first 20 seconds of the communication, and we recorded all motion data, of course. And then we blended the upper body motion of the partner to my own motion that happened 3 seconds ago. We buffered this motion. We hold this state for 9 seconds, and then we blend back to the original motion of the partner, and we idled for 20 seconds again, repeated this cycle throughout the communication scenario. And this was the study we performed between subjects assigned. One group was seeing their original motions, and one group was seeing the motions with the injected mimicry. We had 40 participants, 24 females, both were equally distributed amongst groups. And the dyadic interactions, of course, and the topic was kind of to negotiate a price of a used car. We welcomed the participants. We gave them some instructions that also helped them to argument during the conversation, like this is a limited edition or this and that is broken. we immersed them and calibrated them. We gave them some slight acclimatization time where they could look at the object to have kind of the same impression of the object. And then the trial followed for 7 minutes, and then we presented them to post-experimental questionnaire. We stopped the trial if they had negotiated a price sooner. So this is the demonstration on how this looked. This was kind of part of the acclimatization phase, where they had time to look at the object. This is the virtual simulation. And then a door would come down, and we would give a cue to start for them to start the interaction. And this is the time where we started to exclude the mimicry injection. And after they shook hands, so this was basically kind of, we noticed in pre-tests that most likely people will shake hands in the beginning of the interaction, so we kind of excluded this part. And as you can see here, so the wooden mannequin basically shows what is demonstrated to me as a communication partner, and the blue would be the original motion performed. So we blended then back to the original motion and so on. So of course, I would only see the mannequin. And this is kind of repeatedly appeared after 20 seconds again, and so on and so on. Maybe we can. And the blending method was basically just a linear interpolation over 2 seconds. No, 1 second, I think. Okay. So as for the results, As for the results, we basically also evaluated this prototype because we wanted to learn from this prototypical implementation, and we saw that mimicry was injected about 25% of the overall communication time, which is all right, I think. On average, 8.39 mimicry injections took part during the conversation. And only, what was surprising for us, only 2 comments suggested that they kind of were suspicious about the movement, that was artificial or something was wrong or somebody made similar movements. So we think that was quite successful. Considering the dependent variables, we measured co-presence, social presence, rapport, interpersonal attraction, trust, and realism, and we did not find any significant effects, nor did we find any effects regarding like the functional communication, interaction time, negotiation price, and so on. So for one side, this is maybe not very special findings, but on the other hand, it's also not worse than the real interaction, which is quite a success for us already. So as for discuss, one thing we think we need to improve is that periodic injection is not maybe the best idea. We should use trigger signals, so injecting mimicry only when I'm, for example, a listener or a speaker, depending on how the conversation is going, and also maybe not mimic this kind of gestural movements people are doing, because this might have a negative effect if I'm a listener, but still kind of having this slight gestural movements. So we want to exclude this. But we think why almost nobody detected these modifications is partly also due to the overall situation was quite new for most people. So they were having tracking suits, they were embodied, they're having VR glasses on. They were probably not as much experienced as all of you would be. So we think that the part of not detecting it is that they didn't have a direct comparison. Okay, so for future work, as I said, we would like to include these trigger signals, as speaking is listening, for listener-speaker paradigms. But we also currently are working on including further nonverbal channels. So the current system supports gaze and facial expressions. We're thinking about judging these behaviors on a semantic level, for example, not to mimic any specific gestures, but rather mimicking poses. And also we are having included some machine learning algorithms to detect, for example, head nodding and so on, to see kind of how the conversation is going in a status of is it currently going okay or is it going very, very wrong. And some implications which I'm happy to discuss with you also is that we think that this is very beneficial for diagnosis, therapy and training, for example, for people that suffer from social disorders, but also for examples as job interviews that give everybody a same chance. Intercultural interactions where gestures and behavior have to be adapted. As well as we can kind of support systems where these signals are missing, because we learn a lot on how body motion works, and essentially also cover transmission disruptions, and of course also in the area what Alexander presented in a paper recently. We have a nice method for psychological and behavioral research, of course. But we know there are a lot of ethical implications, and this is also kind of what we are aiming to do with this, to develop these systems, because there is this big boom, because as you know, a lot of big companies, a lot of big stakeholders are investing in this kind of applications, and it will not be far till we all transmit all our behaviors and all our data. And the question is really what to do with it, and how do we cover this ethical and security problems. And with this, I thank you very much and open for questions.
Thank you very much. This is really an inspiring, slightly scary idea. I like that you presented it at this stage. If I got this right, not to put a finger on it, but essentially in your particular studies, you weren't able to show that your modifications had a positive effect. They just had basically no effect compared to the unmodified
Exactly.
encounter.
Exactly.
Okay.
So which, from one side, of course, it's...
Yeah, you didn't mess it up.
We
Right.
didn't mess it up,
Mm-hmm.
exactly, and,
Mm-hmm.
and for us, we did test on healthy participants. We always have to say this, so that's kind of the gold standard you can most likely reach. There's some variance, of course. Females do much better in these nonverbal parts as males, but we tested healthy participants, so we didn't disrupt anything in like a very worse
Okay, so
way.
they may already have done a really good job in doing
so,
it anyway.
Yes.
Okay. One thing that I thought seemed a little like a shortcut was the way that you are interpolating. The blending part seems to be pretty critical for me, because at that point you have to not just generate a posture, but you have to generate a motion. And from watching, even the latest movies, we know that that's still really hard, and uncanny valley is right around the corner. So linear interpolation between two body postures seemed to me a bit of a naive approach. You probably want to have more something like, an ease in, ease out animation.
Exactly.
How much potential do you think you have in
So
that blending?
we actually tested this. So we had a post-test with the student that did a master project on this, and we did not find this to be extremely critical, but also there's too many varieties to actually test it, and that's especially because what is good for body motion might not be good for facial expressions or for gaze. And for body motion, we found that this ease-in is exponential function works quite good with about two and a half seconds in times. But the results we got from this first study were not that we say, okay, there's one thing to do it really, really wrong and really, really mess it up. I think we also have to see the fact that this is variable on the basis of how much body is moved in how much time and how much distance. So we're thinking now of doing variable functions of this interpolation, so not having a fixed time and so on.
It may also be one of those things where it might be worth, since you're looking at a limited vocabulary really of these kinds of motions, maybe you can actually record actual transitions from A to B and use sort of natural movements as a template that you then sort of parameterize or something. I don't know.
Yeah, we're thinking about it, and also similar collisions play a role, of course, and how we handle kinematics.
Yes, no other question in the audience. I have plenty actually, but one very follow-up question basically is that you currently just interpolate postures. That's what I understood. But you need to consider that we are talking about a grammar of body language, and there is like some postures fit to another in time. Also, where I'm heading makes a difference to the gestures that I apply. So do you consider that whole grammar in your interpolations somehow? Are you planning to do so?
Yeah. So what we're really planning to do is to have more rules included in the system. But the idea is that what we kind of not want to do is to have everything on a very semantic level, like to have this is a pointing thing, this is a didactic thing. I think for us it's more about complexity of movements, basically, where we assess what kind of augmentation we can do, complexity of movements, role of the person, status of the conversation. This is kind of the level we are aiming for, and not like interpreting specific gestures and then putting it that way. So I think there's interpreters from Wagner and Elisabeth Andres' lab that do so, but for us it's not really about this very semantic interpretation layer. So we're going more into how complex motions are, how people are dynamically behaving with each other, how the harmony is basically of this interaction.
Thanks again. I just had one more question. Are there certain contexts in which you've noticed that this sort of pro-social mimicry behavior is more or less likely to arise? The examples that you had were of like the world leaders sitting together having a conversation. Were there maybe specific things you could do, like rather than two people standing around having a conversation, where maybe it would be more likely that you'd see an effect or less likely?
So I'm not a psychologist to excuse that, but I think that basically you can observe it in almost any everyday interaction. May it be a full set of every behavioral feature that you observe, or just like if you just remind yourself a bit over time in the next 2 days, if you have this kind of conversation, and you will notice by yourself that you adapt these kind of movements, which is pretty strange if you detect it on yourself, because it's so much on an unconscious level. I'm not like an expert in nonverbal behavior to this sense, but I think pose is one very big example. Sitting, like kind of crossing legs, but also like turning to somebody, and this kind of overall motion, I think.
One last question. I'm not sure what you were aiming for with the study, because as you mentioned, you had healthy participants, and so it's difficult to achieve better rapport, for example. But what you observed is that that the participants didn't observe the injection, which is interesting, and perhaps that's what you were aiming for. Now the question is, at what points would it become more observable? And then the main question becomes, okay, what does it mean, as you also mentioned? And therefore, did you ask your or did you inform your participants afterwards about what you did, and what were their reactions?
Yeah, we informed them, of course, what we did, and that's really not we didn't want to scare anybody off. Basically, what we aim for is to assess this on a prototypical level, because we want to have this in a clinic. We're working together with neuroscientists quite some time. But before we put this into clinical setups, we really have to test a lot, because these trials with people that suffer from certain disorders are always very expensive in terms of you have to be really sure about what you're doing, and this is what, like, we really are happy with that, because we find out a lot of stuff that can go wrong and cannot go wrong. I think the experiment, if you put it as such, is quite controlled, and the reason why it is quite controlled is because the people were quite limited in their space of action. We told them, okay, now you start this conversation, and then the garage was down, so they couldn't look at the object anymore. And so I think if they have much more complex gestures, if the environment gets more complex, if you have more certain actions, then this will be much more detectable. That would be my opinion. And also, they were still standing into a certain distance where you wouldn't have too much haptic interaction. In the end, we also stopped the mimicry before they shook hands. So if you noticed, okay, they're going to find a consensus, we stopped this injection. But obviously, if you have haptic interaction and your arm is there, but it's not there, then it would be a problem, yeah. So that's kind of the limitation.
Let's thank the speaker again.